Well, a push is underway in Michigan to strengthen penalties for hate crimes. It comes as the state has seen an increase in hate crimes, including in the Upper Peninsula. And TV6's Caden Minus explains a vote today from Michigan Civil Rights Commission and what it means.
Meeting in Marquette today, the Michigan Civil Rights Commission expanded its support of hate crime legislation. The commission passed a resolution supporting executive and legislative action that would expand what's classified as a hate crime and add alternative penalties for hate crimes. The commission specifically mentioned desecration and vandalization.
I think this is an important resolution to consider in light of many actions and activities that are starting to happen around the state of Michigan as well as this country. There have been acts of desecration among Jewish synagogues in Grand Rapids.
Instances of hate crimes have also been found in the Upper Peninsula. Earlier this month, 23-year-old Nathan Whedon was indicted for allegedly painting swastikas on Temple Jacob and Hancock. Back in June, 19-year-old Sean Pietola from Pickford was indicted by grand jury for allegedly making anti-Semitic threats on Instagram. A commissioner who graduated from Marquette Senior High School says it's important to address civil rights issues for the entire state.
The civil rights issues in Detroit and Grand Rapids and Traverse City are largely a lot of the same issues that are affecting Ypres as well. So it's not only important to come up and have a meeting up here, but it's also important to, showcase to the people here that we are concerned about the civil rights issues of all Michiganders, and especially and including residents of the Upper Peninsula.
Currently, hate crimes are classified as physical contact to an individual, destruction or defacement of property, or a threat to do either based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. The resolution supports a state house bill that would add protection for age, mental or physical abilities, and LGBTQ individuals. The legislation would also allow for an alternative sentence where the offender could serve the community they acted against. Right now, punishments can be up to 2 years in prison or a $5,000 fine or both. Caden Minus, TV6 News, Marquette.